This is Duke University.
Good afternoon. I'm Margaret Humphreys. I'm a historian of medicine and pleased to be participating in this conference. My job is to introduce our last speaker. Alain Bleakley is Emeritus Professor of Medical Education and Medical Humanities at Plymouth University, Peninsula School of Medicine in the UK. He's an international figure in medical education and the medical humanities and the author of over 80 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. He's the author or co-author or editor of 17 books, including books published just this year, Thinking with Metaphors in Medicine, The State of the Art, and with Robert Marshall, Rejuvenating Medical Education, Seeking Help from Home. Need to find help somewhere. Other significant interventions in medical humanities and their role in medical education include the 2014 Medical Humanities and Medical Education, How the Medical Humanities Can Shape Better Doctors, and Patient-Centered Medicine in Transition, as well as Medicine, Health, and the Arts Approaches to the Medical Humanities with Victoria Bates. Now, Dr. Bleakley has a very peculiar background.
Thank you.
And that's a trait that, in my experience, tends to mark those who move across medicine and humanities with confidence and quirkiness. It's sort of, we know each other when we see. His early academic background was in zoology, then in psychology and cultural studies. His doctorate from the University of Sussex examined the use of the animalizing imagination in ancient shamanism and modern psychotherapy. Not your usual medical student background. He also trained as a psychotherapist and has a clinical practice alongside his academic work in medical education. His work on medical education included a number of significant curricular innovations. In particular, he introduced the first core integrated and assessed medical humanities program in any medical school at his school in the UK in 2002. He's also a widely published poet with 2 collections and work in the Times Literary Supplement, London Review of Books, Manhattan Review, and is widely anthologized. Dr. Bleakley is a fellow of the Academy of Medical Educators and from January 2014, president of the Association for Medical Humanities. He's a founding member of the Rogano Academy for Medical Educators, a visiting scholar at the Wilson Center in Toronto, associate editor of Advances in Health Sciences, Theory and Practice, and on the editorial boards of multiple journals. He lives in the far west of Cornwall, UK, with his wife Sue, a visual artist, surrounded by a further 2 generations of family. He's been surfing regularly for 50 years. I told you, quirky. I mean, all right. And is passionate about music, particularly contemporary jazz. So, without further ado, I welcome Dr. Bleakley. Hope you do too.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm going to criticize medicine, the culture of medicine, rather than particular or individual doctors, but I'm not doctor bashing. A lot of my friends are doctors and they're amazing people, and I'm certainly not out to doctor bash, but I am renowned for the way in which I critique the medical culture in order that it can help itself. So let's start with a couple of doctors. This just fell into my lap last week. I read the Financial Times just on the weekend because it has a really good review section, fantastic review section. It's just worth it for that. And they have very good book reviews, and they often have interesting articles like this. By the way, I've come out from behind the pulpit so that I can join the congregation, and then I can watch what you're watching, and I will be reading stuff from there too, like a poem in a minute. So here's a conversation between a brain surgeon, a very famous brain surgeon called Henry Marsh, and a very, very famous cardiac surgeon called Stephen Westerby. Henry Marsh says, "As a surgeon, you have to learn to dissemble and deceive. You have to appear confident and knowledgeable and certain, even when you don't feel it. So I like to say, self-deception is an important clinical skill." Pause and think. Self-deception is an important clinical skill. And for this one, you may need a gin and tonic. This is Stephen Westerby. At medical school, I went from being a nice, considerate young man who wouldn't say boo to a goose to an aggressive young man who by then was fit to be a heart surgeon. I got injured playing rugby, similar to your American football, but without the kit. I got injured playing rugby, a bifrontal head trauma that caused psychopathy, and I had a complete personality change. He is not pulling your leg, I promise you. If you look at psychopaths' brains on MRI scans, they're short of grey matter at the front. I wasn't born like that, but somebody provided me with it. And what we know now, actually, is that a very high number of surgeons score very, very highly on the psychopathic assessment lists. You've got to have the characteristics of a psychopath to make a good surgeon. This is where I live, with Sue, my wife, who's here, who's a visual artist. We have family around us. I surf regularly. It's the one thing I've done for most of my life. I've done it for kind of 54 years or something. And we joke about looking out of our window. We have a beautiful view of the Atlantic Ocean, looking out of our window at Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is just over the horizon. So this is what I'm going to talk about. On the back of Freud, and remember that Freud did not win a Nobel Prize for science, he won the Goethe Prize for literature, and that's why I keep reading him, because his literary style is so good. So I don't believe what he says, although I'm steeped in the psychoanalytic tradition, and this talk is steeped in psychoanalysis, but I do believe he's a beautiful writer. So from Freud, we're going to gather that medicine's inflations do happen. So my first thing is to describe that medicine is inflated. The second part of the talk draws from Foucault, and we'll have a look at the emergence of dominant discourses in medicine historically, and we'll then ask about resistance to that, which is the third part. So the historical conditions of possibility for the emergence of inflation in medicine is the why question, and then modes of resistance to that inflation, which again we get from Foucault in terms of capillary power, moving against sovereign power, is the how question. How shall we resist this inflation, or how shall we tune it? In medical education, our work is to tune the inflation of doctors. That's the primary work that I've done for a number of years. So let's have a look at what we mean by medicine's inflation. I'm going to start with my father. So right from the first evening of this conference, when we had those beautiful poems, how many people were there on that evening? So yeah, quite a few. So they were just amazing. We really loved that. And one of the issues that came up, or one of the topics that came up, was the inspiration that the younger generation get from the expiration of the people who've died. So the grandmother passes down to the granddaughter. In my case, the father passes down to me. My father died when I was 21. He was a fit and active person. Here he is in the 1950s, very interested in cars. But he became a fisherman. He bought a trawler and he bought a shark fishing boat, and he fished out of a harbour in Newquay in Cornwall, which is where I was born and where I grew up. And he was a fit and active person. He was a hard-bitten Scotsman, quite a heavy drinker, and a pretty jocular person, but ruddy and fit. And then all of a sudden, he fell ill. And within about 3 months, he died of pancreatic cancer. So the expiration of my father starts this talk. Laura Marx says, associated with the soul, animating the lungs, breath is that invisible and usually intangible entity that makes this passage known sonically. Well, what about the sonic of the breath on expiration? The creeping absence of the sonic, the final emptying of the chest, a hollow gurgling of the death rattle. My father's death rattle lasted about 12 hours. A sigh of resignation, and finally, a wholesale withdrawal of noise. You ought to know that the saltire is the Scottish flag. My father was Glaswegian. Fishing with my father in a varnished boat fit for a coffin decked with the saltire. His clenched hands, blue and white too, with the cold, showing a keyboard of bruised knuckles. He died white and blue in his bed, limbs splayed, a smudge on his mouth like beaten egg white, a bluish body as slight as fish flakes, crossing the longitude of the bedsheet. His storms had passed, and their traces puddled, a fisherman torn from his pots and nets, belly up on a cold cotton island in a dark room with a smell of smoked fish lodged in the grain of the woolen carpet, whiskey-breathed, black-haired St. Andrew, arms and legs akimbo, pinned to the ceiling, my father whispering, "A vision, a vision." A saltwater flood, the room swept away, his heart stopped, the catches hauled in slowly. There are beer and cigarettes at the funeral. His body burned, we stained the day with salt tears. That's the breath gone. Now, although I did a psychology degree, I didn't know very much about the work of Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss until a little bit later after that degree, and I got very interested in the whole process of doing research through grounded theory, which is that you extract a theory from your data rather than deriving data that tests a theory. So rather than setting up a hypothesis and gathering data, the theory emerges from the data itself, and that's the grounded theory idea. Now, Glaser and Strauss did their work looking at care of the elderly and care of the dying. And they saw in this work, piece of sociology, they saw in this work that there became a knot of deception, a pact of closed awareness, an atmosphere of organized secrecy, where family members purposely maintained the fiction that the dying patient might recover. Now, when my father died, the oncologist and our general practitioner, our family doctor, said to us, "Don't tell him that he has cancer." He was dead within 2 months. Don't tell him that he has cancer. And we complied. And I look back on that now with shame and shock, but we complied. And this is during this era when Glaser and Strauss found this work, found out about this compliance in their work. So this context does not allow patients to close their lives with proper rituals, because the disease and the death and the impending death are a secret. Because of the organized deception, relatives' grief cannot be expressed openly. So myself and my family held this thing with my father, who kept asking, "What is wrong with me?" Although he knew that he was dying, but what is wrong with me? We never once discussed that he had cancer. We never once opened up the conversation with him that his death would be soon. So we're moving into the question of why this happens with the medical community. And my answer to that question is psychoanalytic. It's a form of inflation. Inflation is when we swell something or we blow something up. It increases beyond its proper limits in economics. So in psychology, inflation is a state of mind characterized by an exaggerated sense of self-importance, often compensated by feelings of inferiority. And that is the little wound that we shall get in during this talk, is how will we get into the feeling of inferiority in medicine that allows us to mirror back to medical culture that the inflation is not a good thing to carry, but must be tempered. It must be controlled in some way. Now, the inflation itself, to have the inflation, is in some ways a good thing. You have to have the energy to do the work that you do. You have to have the chutzpah to move through the medical culture. But too much inflation is a bad thing. So we're talking about tempering the inflation. So the doctors, the oncologist, and the family physician who said to us, "Don't tell your father that he's dying," they are legitimate specialists as far as their technical knowledge is concerned. They've made a diagnosis, and we accept the diagnosis, and we say, you're the expert, so we won't argue with that. But they're not legitimate specialists as far as communicating that information to the family and to the patient is concerned. We negotiate those positions with them. But what they did, and what they did with the study of Anselm Strauss and Barney Glaser, is that they take on these illegitimate forms of imperialism and colonialism by taking over the world of the family and the patient. So they take the capital of the emotional response that we own, and they own it themselves, and they make decisions about how that capital shall be redistributed amongst the family and the patient. So this is an issue of colonizing that emotional capital, colonizing it and redistributing it. So what are the symptoms of inflation? Well, the most common one that you'll know, and it's been talked about already, is heroism, man up, hubris, and this comes from a fear of failure, from overdeterminism. And one of the issues about medicine is that while structural factors put doctors in increasingly difficult positions in terms of overworking them, doctors also see overwork as a badge of honor. So how do you bring those two together without burnout all around, or without falling into the patterns that we're talking about already about inflation? Here's Henry Marsh again. I often think I became a brain surgeon to justify my own sense of self-importance. The funny thing about medical hubris is that nemesis is visited on the patients rather than the surgeon. What's funny about that? There is nothing funny about that. It's bizarre. You see the same thing in this new genre of autoethnography, personal confessional autoethnography by surgeons and doctors. And Paul Kalanithi, who died fairly recently and wrote this book, and you know his partner finished the book off. Abraham Verghese wrote the introduction to this book. He says the same thing. I just get pulled into this culture of inflation. When breath becomes air, I die, I'm dying in the process, but I can't let go of this heroism. I must fight against the process of death. In psychoanalysis, this is called the masculine protest. And it comes largely from the work of Alfred Adler. It was Alfred Adler. Adler really is the father of social work. He's the person who turned Freud's individual psychology into a community psychology and psychoanalyzed social groups and communities. And Adler said that humans strive for this masculine sense of superiority over other people. That causes hierarchies and power structures and so on. That's a refusal of the cooperative gesture, of the community gesture. We see that in the work of Donald Winnicott as well. And for Winnicott, this is a regression to infantile forms of control. If you need to situate yourself in a hierarchy, and you need to control others, and you need to be controlled yourself, you're caught in anality, in what Freud called anality. You haven't grown up through the oral to the anal to the genital. The genital stage is sharing. It's not literally about genitality. It's about the sharing of Eros. It's about the collaboration of how we use Eros, and it's about the redistribution of the capital of Eros, which those doctors didn't know how to do. And the doctors who treated my father didn't know how to do. But they wanted that capital for themselves to give themselves the power. So Donald Winnicott says, here are the characteristics of the masculine process, the masculine protest: a refusal of democratic habits, the inability to develop empathy, a need for hierarchy, and most importantly, intolerance of ambiguity. And we will just move on to Theodore Adorno, who I haven't got, sorry, we can go back. Theodore Adorno famously wrote the book about the authoritarian personality, in which the central characteristic is intolerance of ambiguity. So we're talking about inflation as a psychological condition. we're looking at it psychoanalytically, and we're talking about it as anality. Piero Manzoni canned his own shit and sold it at the equivalent weight that gold was worth at the time. So that is about hanging on to your shit. And that is about not allowing people close to you because you want to maintain control till you get into this crabby stuff. And you hang on to it, but it leaks out sideways and hurts people that way. Every so often, you just let it go. But you let it go over somebody. Pooping on people in 12 easy lessons. We know about intolerance of ambiguity from Keats. This is what the person who is in the anal stage and is unable to cope with democratic structures cannot do, which is to stay in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without irritable reaching after fact and reason. That's a negative capability. So inflation is the inability to cope with staying in that position where uncertainty and ambiguity are happening on the doorstep. You have to be able to turn it into something that you can control. One way of doing that is never admit your mistakes. Cover up in the culture, don't whistleblow, ostracize others who whistleblow. And one of the central areas of concern with that in medical education research is looking at medical error, which is an area that I've been involved in for many, many years. So here's something that was published quite recently. There's a very famous article in which there was a claim that medical error is the third leading cause of death in the USA, and those authors claim that 250,000 people a year died of medical error. That is a huge overestimate, and there are all sorts of problems with that research. But we do know that at least 25,000 people, maybe more, die every year because of medical error in the USA, and a figure in the UK maybe about 12,000. Although some people claim it's as high as 40,000. Now, when this research came out, there was a big hoo-ha about it, and on the Medscape medical news website, which is a pretty good website and you can trust it, well, there were a lot of people who suddenly came out and said, this research is a load of garbage. Tripe, extrapolated hogwash, bogus, outrageous, absurd, insulting, and a joke. And then a few other physicians snuck in and said, now hang about. Actually, we've got to face up to this. There is a lot of medical error, and we can't brush it under the carpet. It's a form of hubris to say that there is not medical error. So these were the typical responses. Medical errors are hugely underreported. People are practicing at the edge of their scope and not appropriately asking for guidance. Be careful of the ego. Be careful of the anal state that the ego can get in. And try to be aware of what you don't know. Back to Henry Marsh. Doctors and surgeons have a very complicated relationship with patients. As soon as we have any interaction with patients, we start lying. We have to. There is nothing more frightening for a patient than an anxious or doubtful doctor. So we're back to the knot of deception. We're back to where we were in the family situation that I was in. Now, oncology doesn't work that way anymore. And people are told what's happening with them, and families do discuss that. But that doesn't mean that inflation in medicine has disappeared. It's just shifted. It's shifted sideways. So what I'm going to do in the second part of the talk, are you all with it and okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If you feel that you need to just get up and move around or shout out or ask a question or whatever, you can do that spontaneously. But I'm just going to barrel on for another 3.5 hours or so. We'll see where we are.
I have one question. Comment. Inflation medicine resulted as in physicians that have developed narcissistic, I think, characteristics.
Yeah.
It's inflated self-importance.
Okay.
And so habitual narcissistic behaviors.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So that's another way of putting it. Habitual narcissistic behaviors. That's an excellent way of putting it. So let's have a look at the historical conditions of why this came about. It didn't just drop into our laps. Medical culture wasn't always like this. And the assumption that things that happen in medicine now must be tempered with a knowledge of history. So where does this come from? Well, we have to go back to the Enlightenment, and there it is in the word. And we have to look at the aerial imagination Enlightenment, because this is all about getting up in the air. This is where inflation is situated historically. So we have to go back to the science of the late 18th century, when people wanted to know what this thing was, this intangible thing around us called air. What is it? Can we dissect it out? Can we analyze it? Can we weigh it? Can we measure it? Because we can't get a hold of it. We can feel it in breath. We can feel it in the body. We know that the lungs do something, but we can't get a hold of it. When we put a bird in a flask and we take the air out, the bird dies. Well, good. Not good for the bird, but we know that we need the air, we need the breath. And this famous painting by Joseph Wright shows the various responses of people to that. For some, the scientific experiment is a wonder. For others, it's a terrible thing. What about the bird? So this moment in the Enlightenment is a really, really important, crucial moment historically, because up to that time, an alchemical theory called phlogiston had held sway. And the idea was that if you burn a metal, the metal increases in weight. The alchemical view is you drive off an enlightening spirit that's in that metal to make the metal depressed. Therefore, it gets heavier. The chemical view is you add oxygen. And that was the great discovery of the day. When Joseph Priestley isolated oxygen in 1774, suddenly we started seeing some important things. At the same time, 1767, Priestley found out how to carbonate water. Now, there's a whole culture of enlightenment for us now that we live in. The Coca-Cola culture is entirely concentrated in this part of history. Here's the first soda fountain. Here's a soda jet from the 1930s, and we needn't go on. Here's the first balloon flight, 1783, and then this culminates in what happened close to here, which is the first powered flight. In the UK, the discovery of carbon dioxide and the discovery of nitrous oxide led to all sorts of experimentation. This guy, Humphrey Davy, is a son of the town where we live in Penzance in West Cornwall, and he went to Bristol and started experimenting. And the reason I've introduced him here is because he was a very close friend of Samuel Taylor Coleridge for some time, and Coleridge was involved in these experiments where people sniffed nitrous oxide, and it gave them a big lift, a big poetic lift. "Oh, Tom," said Robert Southey, "such gas has Davy discovered, the gaseous oxide, the nitrous oxide. Oh, Tom, I've had some. It made me laugh and tingle in every toe and fingertip. Davy has actually invented a new pleasure for which language has no name. Oh, Tom, I'm going for more this evening."
Just think if he had OMG.
OMG, yes. So Coleridge was a part of this, and he heard somebody say at one of these meetings that when they sniffed nitrous oxide, they felt like the sound of a harp. And Coleridge pulled that into one of his poems. "And what if all animated nature be but organic harps diversely framed that tremble into thought?" That's the aerial imagination. That's the nitrous oxide at work. That's where Coleridge's imagination was at this particular time. So we soaked ourselves a little bit in the Enlightenment, but prior to that, and as a result of the Enlightenment, there was a reinforcement of a particular view that was emerging in medicine. And I'm going to talk about two of these views, and one has already been introduced by Juan earlier, which I'm really grateful for, because it was a beautiful poetic introduction to what I'm going to say in a very dull and, and slightly lower toned way. two things happen in medicine historically. One is that the body became thought of as a machine. Therefore, the end product of that is we can objectify patients, and that really doesn't matter because only part of a machine, that the person is just a set of stuff that links together and we can fiddle around with it. It's just mechanics and so forth. And the other one is medicine as war, which has stuck with us, and we're still working with that. So here, just before the Enlightenment, is Vesalius, and Vesalius is talking about the fabric of the human body, something that is made or a machine. Descartes, then the body is to be regarded as a machine, an automata, and that leads to modern interpretations like this. It's a quite extraordinary image of a person's organs. So ultimately, the body becomes a factory. And then running parallel with this is the notion, which comes from John Donne, the poet, that medicine is war or combat. And we're in the combat zone. We're constantly in the combat zone. So Donne said that his illness resembled a siege and a cannon shot. He had a fever which blows up the heart, and an illness that invades. Thomas Sydenham was the person who then concretized this. A murderous array of disease has to be fought against, and the battle is not for the sluggish. I steadily investigate the disease, I comprehend its character, and I proceed straight ahead, and in full confidence towards its annihilation. Then Pasteur invented the term biomilitarism, talked about invading armies, talked about the battlefield, and this leads by 1904 to the notion that we're fighting this war against cancer. And this famous article in the BMJ in 1904 talked about the fight against cancer as an imperialist notion. The disease described as darkest Africa waiting to be discovered and conquered. And then later, cancer cells are identified with the Bolsheviks. They're anarchic. We must fight them. We must overcome them. And when Eisenhower talked about the military-industrial complex, there was the perfect metaphor for all of this to fall into, the little metaphorical cup. This is now the industry of medicine with its warfare metaphors concretized in certain kinds of activities. Now, the point about this is that patients have no say in this. So patients have to join in this metaphorical conversation. You can see the whole argument laid out in my new book on metaphors, and it's an argument that has been made before, but I embellish it in certain kinds of ways. So patients have to join this argument whether they like it or not. And most of them don't. And contemporary research shows that people feel in some way that they're stigmatized by these kinds of labels. They don't want to be seen as a machine, and they don't want their illnesses to be thought of as warfare. So we're moving on to part 3, which is about what are our modes of resistance to the way in which medicine, and it has become inflated, and that inflation has caught us and has started to work us over. That the capital that we own emotionally becomes the capital that doctors then own, that they decide how to redistribute. So medical students, patients, and juniors are at the whim of senior doctors in terms of how that emotional capital is redistributed. Not just the knowledge capital, but the social and emotional capital too. Are you okay with that notion? Yeah. So part 3 then, and we're finishing off the talk now, is about forms of resistance to these dominant metaphors and these dominant discourses. And the first one that I'll talk about is just the emergence of new metaphors. So is there something else that may be emerging now which is different from medicine as war and the body as machine? Well, yes, of course, and in fact one mentioned this earlier as well. Medicine as hospitality is the obvious one. This suddenly feminizes and gives a little bit of grace and a little bit of succor and wisdom to what medicine is about. So we're returning the notion of the hospital to true hospitality. You're a guest and we will look after you. We will wash the feet of Odysseus, and we will provide food and comfort for the traveller. And I always take my inspiration from Wallace Stevens, in this little vein of argument when Stevens says that the world is presence and not force. Stevens also said the world is force and not presence, if you want it both ways. But the world is presence and not force means that the idea that something softer, more community-orientated and more contactful is really much more important than forcing your way, in the imperial sense, forcing your way onto somebody else's consciousness or somebody else's land or somebody else's community, and then taking that on board and owning that for yourself, and then deciding on how you redistribute that capital. So that would be a straightforward Marxist argument about that. And I take great inspiration from Hélène Cixous and similar feminist writers in how we might articulate a new form of resistance in talking about metaphors in medicine, which works against the idea that medicine should be this dominating force, this inflationary force that just pushes everybody out. So Cixous talks about subjectivities in terms of writing with mother's milk. It's just a wonderful metaphor, because the milk is also an invisible ink. The inscription is not harsh, but it's also a nourishing liquid, a nourishing substance. And I've written quite a bit about how medicine can become lyrical to get away from its epic, tragic, and dark comic genre. So you know about the epic sense of medicine and the heroism. You know about the tragic, that we're constantly dealing with death. But you may not know so much about the dark comic, which is the awful black humor that still inhabits medicine, which we need to challenge. And I think medicine can become lyrical and should study lyricism. And part of that, we can get some advice about that educationally to bring into medical education from linguists who talk about the value of the subjunctive mood rather than the indicative. So I did a long study filming orthopedic surgeons and their teams and showing them the film back and asking them what they think they're doing in theatre. And we did linguistic analysis on that. And the very simple point that came up is that surgeons use the indicative 70% of the time, and nurses use subjunctive language 70% of the time. So surgeons are always telling, and nurses are always asking. Yeah. So there's conversation that comes out of the nurse's talk. There's simply dictation that comes out of the surgeon's talk. So that's the inscription of a masculinist identity which we must challenge. So a lot of good stuff comes from those French feminists. If anybody's seen Cixous speaking, she is just the most magnetic and marvelous person you could possibly. And I've also drawn a lot of inspiration from Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, who talks about combat breathing. So in the context of the Algerian War, bringing us back to breathing, Fanon says the individual's breathing is an observed and occupied breathing. It is a combat breathing. It puts you into the combat zone, but the breath is different. You can observe my breathing, but you cannot occupy my breath. That's a very important distinction. And because of that, I can fool you in a sense. I can regulate my breathing in such a way that I have ownership of the breath, but you think you have ownership of the breathing. And that's my form of resistance. The easiest way to do that is to deflect the male gaze by wearing a veil so that you can't see my breathing. And you cannot then take my breath or occupy the space of my breath. So when the French are still trying to ban the veil, and when Algerian women don the veil, which the French sought to ban then, during the Algerian War, this kind of resistance is the frustration of the direct gaze of the oppressors, the frustration of the male gaze, which is another way of talking about inflation in medicine. The male gaze in medicine that Foucault so wisely articulates for us can be deflected. So we look at the cartoon first. We'd like to start out by being very involved with you, but eventually be drawn away to much more interesting cases on Twitter. So the doctors have control in that case, but what can the patient do? So as the doctors try to take over the breathing space of the patient, what we need to do, and what doctors as patients also must try and learn to do, is to learn tactics of resistance. And those two tactics from my own research I call informed non-compliance, which is I'm not complying with your instructions and it's not going to make me sicker. I know that because I've talked to people about it and I've got other kinds of views on that. And then what Homi Bhabha calls sly civility. I'm pretending to go along with you, but actually behind your back I'm doing other things. And I'm talking about you in a way which you may not like, particularly. But that's giving me some sense of resistance and some sense of power. So we're going to finish on looking at the work of a performance artist called Martin O'Brien, who's brought this into his work and articulates this view of resistance in a very, very powerful way. Martin has cystic fibrosis. He's in his late 20s. His life expectancy is probably only another 10 years. His lungs are he's gradually drowning in his own fluids. He has to go through intensive physiotherapy, and he's turned his illness into a performance work. He's a very articulate and very interesting guy, has a PhD in English and drama, teaches English and drama, but of course he's completely in this prison of his own illness, but he's turned this into a positive statement in terms of his performances. And he calls this the survival of the sickest. He talks about a zombie apocalypse, so we'll put this into context. When we talk about health and health humanities, and I've written a lot about this, I have a huge resistance to the phrase health humanities, only because, and it may be more of a European thing, I don't read health humanities as healthcare humanities. I read it as an interest in bringing back health. But of course, all of you at this conference know that that's a complex notion, and we've fiddled with that a lot, and we got to a position where we feel quite comfortable with the fact that it's not an easy notion at all for us to understand, and yet we still use the tag health humanities in the same way that medical humanities is difficult, because for people who are in other healthcare professions, why would we want a humanities that only deals with medicine? We want to make it broader than that. But health for me is just a difficult topic, because one person's health is another person's misery. There is a birth lottery of disadvantage and so forth. If you're born ill, then don't talk to me about health. And probably the most complex and most frustrating area is that the very healthy often choose the most risky lifestyles. So they might want to climb the Matterhorn or do extreme sports or drive fast cars or whatever and put themselves at risk. So health is a relative notion. So Martin takes this idea by reversing Darwin's survival of the fittest and talks about survival of the sickest. He imagines a zombie apocalypse where I'd eat you to stay alive. I wouldn't even think twice, it's survival of the sickest. If it were the zombie apocalypse, only the infected could survive. Only the sick will carry on through. This used to be the most optimistic city in the world. Maybe that's Durham. Maybe that's Penzance. It used to be the most optimistic city in the world. Now it's full of darkness, illuminated by the fading street lamps. Out of this darkness stumbles life quite different from us. The unwell negotiate this landscape in a way we could not. There is no war in this city, no poverty, no crime, nothing to fear. There is only sickness, and this sickness in itself, a form of existence, a way of seeing and being, a way of breathing and moving. This is life. They do not fear death because death is already behind them. This city used to be our future, but now the future belongs to the unwell. So what I've said is that inflation is medicine's Achilles heel. It's a necessary part of medical practice, but it's a symptom that needs to be addressed and needs to be resisted. And if you want to get in contact with me, that's my email. And thank you very much for listening. You've been very patient. So how long have we got for questions?
So you've got 40 minutes.
We've got 40 minutes. That's great.
15 minutes?
Or 15 minutes.
15 minutes, yeah.
Thank you very much for that provocative conversation with us. It felt more conversational.
Great, thank you.
I want to query, be devil's advocate to the last claim that this hubris, this masculinist inflation is a necessary part of medicine.
Yeah.
Because I kept thinking that one of the ways to give the feminist critique to this is to go back to, for most of human history, healthcare was done at home by women. And it's only in moving into institutional spaces that men get to dominate.
Sure.
And so if our species was kept alive for so long by women in home spaces, do we really need that masculinist hubris? Do you have the image of the young people out there protesting the inhumane working hours we give to doctors, right? And I do read from you, you're not critiquing doctors per se, you're critiquing the medical system that doctors themselves also suffer under.
Yep.
What if we assumed that we could create a medical system in which surgeons don't have to be that completely false to themselves, always confident, always overly optimistic people, and could actually bring a little bit more of their tenderness and their vulnerability into that space?
Yep. I mean, you've answered the question in your statement.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, for those of you who don't know, around the world now, 60% of intake to medical schools is women rather than men. There's a huge growing sense of tolerance of LGBT and questioning communities within medicine, and that's only in the past 10 years, really, or over the past 5 years, actually. So the future is feminine in a sense, but the feminizing of medicine is quite a different thing. The cultural feminizing of medicine, I think, will take a lot longer. So what I laid out were 3 or 4 forms of resistance where that may happen. But the women who are coming into medicine are certainly a part of that. And the young generation of medical students, as Sue and I still work with, seem to us to be very, very different from older generations. So I think this is in motion. Thank you for the question. It's great.
I've often wondered about, and I like that phrase, the use of subjunctive in language, but I'm also have a problem with it, and especially following a talk like John Hoberman's yesterday, we talked about how we can hide behind language, and we're using the softening and euphemistic instead of calling out race more specifically for what it really is. So I'm wondering if you can comment on softening language, making it sound less, whatever, blunt, aggressive, and at the same time using it as a veil for not, expressing what really is and what should be seen more specifically.
Yeah. I can't remember who it was who talked about rhetoric. One of the talks that I went to is about rhetoric, but I'm certainly very interested in that. And the language, it's important that we teach medical students to see through the rhetoric of the language they use and the language that is used around them. And I think to sharpen that up a little bit, if we got away a little bit from the subjunctive and we talked a little bit more about the lyrical, I think that's where I would like to land. I would like to see I've always argued that medicine needs to move away from the instrumental and needs to embrace the aesthetic and the ethical. It doesn't embrace the ethical at all well, although ethics are taught in medicine. It certainly does embrace the aesthetic. And when in the last presentation, when we talked about design in relationship to medicine, I was thinking about how medicine can be designed to be more beautiful. That's the work we've tried to do in our medical school, is to make the medicine more beautiful. That's the aesthetic side. Well, aesthesis, as you know, comes from sense impression. So the more beauty in medicine is more about how do you appreciate through your senses. So now we're getting down to something which is beyond the fluffiness of language, if you like, and the rhetoric of language, is how you use language in a precise way to increase the possibility of students being able to educate their senses.
Thank you for your talk. I'm interested in your parallels between the changes in medical culture and the accrual of science and knowledge. And it seems that as medicine became more scientifically or evidence-based and tools were gained in terms of medicine, particularly within antibiotics, how those metaphors of the body as machine and medicine as war came about, and how now medicine seems to be an endeavor of fact and science. And my question is, do you think that fact and science and knowledge, are these inherently masculine notions, and is that tied into the masculinity of the current practice of medicine?
Well, it's always a danger, and I often get told off by feminists particularly, that you're just stereotyping, you're getting into old grooves, you know, but there's something about the harsh way in which the logos manages to beat up the eros in medicine. So I'm really calling for more eros in medicine. I'm calling for a more sensitive and a more collective approach that would say something back to that logos of science. But as a scientist originally, I don't have any issue with, I mean, science is full of beauty and grace. And so my first contact with medical students is always, can you recover the beauty and grace of your science? That's my first question. And I work closely with a pathologist, for example, who, while he's very interested in the beauty of the images that he looks at, he warns medical students that, you know, these are images of suffering humans. So let's do the ethical work at the same time as we're doing the aesthetic work. That sharpens up the aesthetics. That makes the aesthetics less kind of fluffy and so forth. But that, I kind of wish medical education would start with the aesthetic and the ethic of and the ethical in the work, rather than the logical, and that the science were taught that way. Yeah. So I think we've got to recruit faculty, science faculty, who literally love the work they do and embrace the work they do.
I feel that our electronic records, like Epic and medical charts, electronic medical charts,
Yep.
and electronic communications with your physicians are starting to change the culture or the medicine culture, and that is that surgeons or just primary care physicians receive feedback from their patients. You have just prescribed this medication. However, I am also concomitantly taking that medication, and I realize there's an interaction from MedLab, from journal articles, etc. And the physician would respond saying, "I am sorry, I overlooked at it, and sorry about that. Yes, there is interaction. You shouldn't take that one. I will correct the medication."
Sure. Yeah.
So that kind of dialogue, from one-way communication from physician just dictating to the patients, from now the two-way dialogues, from not having to wait for another visit, but instant feedback to physicians, etc.
Yeah.
It is changing.
I would agree, but I'd also say we have to be very wary of that, because we're still in a position where physicians can quickly colonize that information. So they grasp ownership and then they redistribute it in such a way that it is no longer the patient's information, even though patients have access to it. So there's a difference between access and acting on that access and feeling that you have ownership of that information. But it's a really good point. Thank you.
I wanted to go back to the secrecy surrounding your father's cancer diagnosis, because that was there's a barbaric way of doing it for a very long period of time. I read that Eva Peron had multiple cancer surgeries without knowing what was wrong with her.
Yeah.
But then I'm wondering what happens when you start to look at this medical hubris across cultures, and in particular because I think we all see this evolution of oncology that used to never tell the patient, and now you always tell the patient, which we think of as human progress, I think. But then, how do you reflect on the issue of you're a American British doctor in a country where that's unthinkable? That it's unthinkable for adult children to tell their dying parents that they have cancer in many countries. And how does one see that as sort of something that will change with time inevitably, or something that we should interfere with? Or how would you imagine, approaching that dilemma with both insight and without hubris?
I come back to the colonizing. I mean, if when you see that situation, if you smell a rat, and you think somebody has taken over, it's a power situation. So let's go back to Foucault. So the sovereign power situation is somebody has taken over this information and is guiding the discussion and is guiding the collective discussion and the collective gaze in such a way that it always comes back to the colonizer's perspective. Then I'm going to fight that. If I see a situation in which some kind of power starts to emerge, which is the capillary power of the resistance of those people who are being colonized, then I say, okay, let's get on their side and work with medical education to help with that. And eventually that will meet the sovereign power gaze and deflect it, like those Algerian women did. And at that point, then things, I think, would become more democratic. So, I mean, the heart of all of my writing is how do we democratize medicine? And for me, Jacques Derrida is the only sensible writer on democracy, which is that democracy is always a horizon. It's a democracy to come. We're never in democracy, or Michael Hart and Antonio Negri talk the same way. We're never in a democracy. But let's hope that we're moving to the horizon. And we're collectively trying to form that democratic. And then I think the emotional capital within families, between doctors and their patients, will start to be redistributed with equity. It doesn't answer your question. I've just fluffed it up, which is my rhetorical technique.
Should we thank our speaker and continue conversations with him?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.